Hello, it's Weedy and welcome to another video. It's the end of 2024 and we have a few more days left, and so I thought it would be fitting to film a little video talking about some of my favorite books from the year that I read. So we have a good mix of books that I had known about, some that I never knew about before. Without further ado, let's just jump right in. I'm going to be going by chronological order or the order that I read them in, just because I feel like that's the most fair. I don't want to say that I like one book more than the other, just this is the order that I read them in, and this is the order that I present them to you. The first one that I read this year was The Gift of Being Yourself by David G. Benner. And now I usually tend to read nonfiction classical literature based in about the 19th or the 20th century. Typically that's what I gravitate towards. But this book was an exception to that. Not something that I usually go for, but I'm glad I did. While a lot of the topics in this are ones that you may feel already familiar with, and I found myself a few times saying, well, that makes sense, I already know this. But even as you read through it, I find that there were so many interesting quotes, there were so many interesting stories of understanding identity, of the call to understanding oneself, and even just the idea that to deepen one's knowledge of self is to deepen one's knowledge of God, and that to become our authentic selves, we must become authentically like Christ. And this idea that only in truly mirroring or reflecting Christ can we begin to know our true selves. With it's a novel idea in psychology for me, at least whenever I read books on psychology. Usually they don't come from that viewpoint or that lens, and I loved it. I loved seeing that, and I loved reading it, and I think I'm going to look for more psycho-spiritual literature because that was just a breath of fresh air for me. The second book we had was Brother, I'm Dying by Edwige Dandicat, and I think to understand why I love this book so much, you have to learn a little bit about my sister and I. So we're both, our family, I should say, is Liberian. Both my parents are from Liberia. The rest of my ancestors are from Liberia, as far as I know. And my parents left Liberia. They fled because of the war, and I was born in Israel in 2001, and then I stayed there until 2004 when I was 3 years old. We immigrated to Canada, and I've been here ever since. So a lot of my reckoning or wrestling with my identity has been because in some ways I feel really lost to this Liberian identity. I feel like it's lost from me. While tangibly I know that I am and I could trace my lineage in some way to the continent, I've never stepped foot on the continent of Africa. And to really figure out who I am without knowing half of my story is something that I've struggled with. And in a way, I also know my parents struggle with that similarly, but in a completely different way, where they haven't seen some of their family. It's been decades since they've seen some of these people. And so we have this book, we're presented with this book that's nonfiction, and it's beautifully written, as if it were a work of fiction. I found the stories in it were so vivid. In fact, it really helped me consider my writer's craft, to consider how I wanted to tell my story. At the age of 4, which is 1 year older than I was when we left, Edwige Dandicat came to think of her uncle as her second father, and she grew up with her uncle because her dad and her mom had left to go and live in America to make enough money so they could go and send for her and her brother. So she's living in Haiti at the time with her brother and her uncle and her aunt, while her parents are in the U.S. At the age of 12, she packs up her things, her parents come, and they take them to the U.S. Edwige doesn't know if she will ever see her uncle again. And so this book is such a beautiful study. It is truly a story about love. Love for his daughter, love for his niece, love for her father, love for her uncle, love for this family that is torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. And it was a story that helped me reflect on my own story. And I love books like that. I cried. I cried throughout this book. I cried at the end. I felt so hopelessly in despair. I felt frustrated, and I could feel all the anger in my heart, in my spirit, boil up for this family. And then I felt like, wait, maybe that anger is for mine. And it was just a fantastic read, and I would recommend it. It's pretty short, flies by, it's absolutely wonderful. Next, we have the book Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymore, an Introduction by J.D. Salinger. Now, in the last book video that I did 3 years ago now, I want to say, I was talking about reading Franny and Zoe, which I have here. I also have Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters, but I can't find it right now because I had it in my bag when I was at a picnic, and I don't know where the bag is, so that's that. I finished it when I was at the picnic, so I didn't take it out. So I'm going to be pretending this is Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters. Change the book title for me. Just ignore that. Same as in Franny and Zoe and a lot of different short stories that are put together. There are 2 stories within this one book. So the first one is Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters, and then the second one is Seymore, an Introduction. So in Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters, we have Seymour's wedding. Buddy Glass, who is the second oldest brother in the Glass family, goes to the wedding, and spoiler alert, skip this right over if you don't want to know what happens, but he goes and the wedding is failed. There's no wedding. Seymore doesn't show up. He leaves the bride at the altar. Disaster. So we follow what happens in a limo. We follow what happens at their apartment, and we get to see everything is told from the view of Buddy. We never actually even hear from Seymore except through his journal. Even though we never see him, even though we never hear him, even though we're never introduced to him, we already know so much about this character. We see so much about his motivations, his intents. We see his thoughts, his wishes, his desires, his hopes, his dreams, his disappointments. We learn so much about this character, and he hasn't even stepped foot on the page. It's wonderful writing, and I absolutely just adore J.D. Salinger's work. Now, the second part of the book is written in a stream of consciousness type of way, which didn't land as well with me, but I did enjoy it. Don't get me wrong, I liked Seymore in Introduction, but Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters was my favorite part of the book. This one's only 250 pages-ish, so you can get through it pretty quickly as well. It took me a little bit longer to get through Seymore in Introduction because it doesn't really have a plot. It doesn't really have anything except more like a eulogy to Seymore as he passed away. As we know, if you read Perfect Day for Banana Fish, he's already passed away. So this is set a few years down the line. And it's written from Buddy Glass again. It's kind of talking about Seymore and what we should know. It kind of is a really beautiful way to understand Seymore, see Seymore through the eyes of someone else and through someone who knew him very well. And none probably knew him better than his brother. We also get a lot of different stories from his childhood, which I found endearing and I really did like. After that, we once again read a nonfiction book, and this one was because Nandi Rose, or Halfway, if you are not familiar with her, she is an artist based in upstate New York. She is also part of the band Pine Grove, and she has her own personal practice as an artist, as a musician. She is currently on tour too, or going to be on tour in the new year. So if you like her music, you might actually be interested in this. But she had a miscarriage, and one of the books that she read during her time of grief was The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal, and The Sacred Work of Grief by Frances Weller. So I read this even though I wasn't necessarily grieving something as traumatic as miscarriage, but I feel that I have often been too detached from my grief, and I feel like I don't often allow myself the chance to truly mourn things in my life because I feel like I'm not, this grief is not mine. I can't hold on to it because this grief belongs to someone else. If someone in my family is sick, when my dad was really struggling with kidney failure, I felt like that grief wasn't mine because I wasn't the one suffering even though I was struggling. And that's been something I've dealt with for all of my life, and I didn't know how to break free from that. And so, reading this book, Francis Weller held space for both grief that feels like your own and grief that is collective. And he helps guide us or ushers us through this mourning process and shows us different rituals that we can use for renewal, that we can use to truly mourn and move through our grief in a way that allows us to massage our hearts rather than let them become calloused. Within the first few pages, I wept. And I wept heavily for all the things that I had not mourned in my life, all the losses that I had faced, all these different goings, comings, and goings and endings. And I mourned beautiful things. I mourned for the squirrels that I saw on the pavement. I mourned for the climate. I mourned for the earth. I mourned for people that I feel are lost spiritually. And I found that this book held space for all of that. I was reading some reviews that were pretty lower, that were low, people that gave it 3 stars, 2 stars, and they were saying they didn't really feel like they wanted to deal with their grief by going through incantations or doing rituals and things. And I thought, I mean, to each their own, but I find that these have been used since time immemorial, time for millennia, and there's a reason why our ancestors, I would say, had dealt with grief differently than us. And I feel like our society, and I feel like currently we don't deal with grief very well. So I wanted a new perspective, and this book gave me that. Once again, we had a book that was more of a nonfiction, spiritual, self-help, psychological book. This one was Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation by Parker J. Palmer. I read this one about September-ish, October, and I found that it's so interesting that I find that around October time is when I fall into a pit of depression. It's happened for the past 4 years now, where every October I have a major depressive episode around October, and I thought that maybe I would read this book because I found the title just itself was intriguing. Let your life speak. How can you let your life speak? How do I listen to what my life is telling me? I found from the very beginning the book captured me from the very beginning. It doesn't even assume that he knows better than us. It doesn't assume that Parker J. Palmer is out here to tell us anything. It doesn't really come from a place of, I know best and you should listen to me, or I'm giving you advice. It's really just him telling his story, and if you find it helpful, if you find any of his paths or the ways that he's directed his life at all helpful, then take from it what you will, learn from him. And if you don't, that's okay too, because maybe what he's saying isn't for you, and maybe what he's saying doesn't resonate with you, and that's okay. I love that stance. I love that positioning, that posturing. And so I was able to approach the book in a way that felt genuine, in a way that felt authentic to me, and that felt like I had some knowledge. It reflected my agency, it reflected the wisdom that I've gained and that I've garnered over the years as well. He's saying, look, as an individual, you have so much wisdom in your own life, and nobody can shape that, nobody can discern that better than you can. Nobody can do it for you. And so you have to do the work of letting your life speak, of listening to your life as it's speaking, and to follow the path that you're being called to. And I loved that. I think, though, the favorite part of the book for me, I remember we were driving from Toronto to Grand Rapids, and on the way back, this is when I was really getting to the book. On the way back, he talks about a period of depression that he was going through. It's not a one and done solution. It shows us over the years how Palmer is really able to continue doing the work again and again and again and again, of listening to his life, of discerning where his vocation lay, of discerning where the Spirit was leading him next, and to understand what he was being called to do. I loved the gentle guidance that Parker J. Palmer offers and the wisdom that he is able to convey through simple words. There are so many quotes that I underline. I think best of all, this book left me feeling hopeful. And That's something that I cannot be grateful for or thank him for enough. The last book I read was by Patrick Modiano, and he's a French author, playwright. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2014, and the book that I read was Dans le Café de la Jeunesse Perdue. This book was not one that I expected to like as much as I did. I thought it was a TikTok book. I had seen it come up on Pinterest, and I thought, seems interesting. It's French, so I had a bigger inclination to read it, and it took me like 2 hours to get through. It's so good. It's so good. I didn't really want to read a translation, so I read it in French. So I'm not sure what my experience would have been if I read it in English, but this book is so impactful that I cried at the end of it. A lot of the books that I really love are ones that I cry at the end of, but this book is detailing the comings and goings of one girl in particular, Ruki, who is in this cafe, and it's told through the eyes of those that are around her. None of these people are really important with who they are to her, except for the last individual. It's not a plot-driven book at all. Nothing happens in the slightest. But I found myself so captivated by his writing, his mastery of the craft. It was a really gloomy, melancholic book, and I felt honestly pretty down after reading it. But it's an unabashed look at life through the perspective of some individuals in their young adulthood. Yeah, I really loved it. Those were all my 5-star books for 2024. Let me know what you've been reading and what books that I should read next. I'm already gathering up my list of TBR for 2025, hopefully looking to get through some more books, but out of the 40 books I read this year, those 5 are the ones that stood out to me the most. So I hope that you pick up any of these ones. They're all really short reads and you can get through them quickly. Perhaps that's why I like them. This year was a bit of a change. I usually like longer books. I like books that I can sit with for a long time. But these ones were really quick to get a hold of, but also quick to get through and quick to fall into my affections. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope that you have an excellent evening, good afternoon, evening, or good night, wherever you are. Stay safe, be well. I love you very much forever. Bye.